I'm William Graper, and this is The Recovering Elitist, a show that explores the space between who we appear to be and who we actually are, the tension, our transformations, and the truth behind success. Michael Sebastian, welcome to The Recovering Elitist. I wanted to have you on the show because as Editor-in-Chief of Esquire magazine, you lead with what I feel is this incredible emotional intelligence that's also really rooted in practicality and deeply masculine. And this is a tension that I am endlessly fascinated by. And we'll get into this and we'll also learn a bit about what you're recovering from. But before we do that, we have to go back. And I want to know a little bit about who raised you. Can you tell me a little bit about what that was like and who were your early influences?
I grew up in a suburb of Chicago called Park Ridge. It's right on the northwest edge of Chicago. So like a couple of blocks over was the city. I think as I had mentioned to you, is that this was in the 80s and 90s. This was like John Hughes country. And so, the high school where I went was basically a replica of the one in the Breakfast Club and so on. And so it's like, I am watching these movies growing up thinking that they're modeling it off of my own childhood. And so it felt idyllic in a way. And even though it was right on the edge of the third largest city in America, which we went to all the time, it also had a small sort of tight-knit community to it. Also interestingly enough, a lot of interesting people have come from Park Ridge. Hillary Clinton, Harrison Ford, the editor of Esquire. So there you go.
And so who raised you in that setting?
My mom and my dad, kind of classic nuclear family. I have an older brother. My dad, he had a family business. It's a real estate company, still exists, Sebastian Company Real Estate, which was founded in 1929. And my dad was basically the third generation. He and his brother ran it. And that office was on the same block as our house. So he would wake up in the morning and he would go to work just on the same block. And he would come home for lunch and so on. And now my brother is at that real estate company. So has kept it in the family.
What are the qualities that you look back on that time and distill from it? You talked about an ease and a safety. What is that feeling that you feel when you think about your childhood and that idyllic upbringing?
It's a really good question. I think it's something that, so there was this sense of comfort and safety to that and ease. And, in a way, I guess it's something that if I really think about it, I'm constantly kind of looking for in my own life. I'm married. I have two daughters who are 10 and 6. And, looking for that for them too. My wife, who is in fact trained as a therapist, she works in mental health, once pointed something out to me that I thought was spot on, is that I love to travel. I travel for work, travel for fun. The context of this conversation came up, which was that until very recently, I was always eager to move. Not necessarily move cities, so sometimes, but move apartments or something like that. And my wife always wanted to stay put. She was always like, no, we live here. People know where we live. Why do we want to pick up and move to a new apartment? And she sort of diagnosed it as, you had such a rooted childhood and your parents still live in that house and you can still go back to that house. That has given you the freedom to wander and to explore. And I think she's correct about that.
That's such an incredibly poignant way of looking at this because I'm often thinking about tethers in our life and, we need a certain amount of tethers, and no matter how free-spirited we are, that allow us to feel like we can go take risks. And so sometimes I think that's a home or sometimes that's a relationship or a career. But I think as humans, we do long for that. And so having such a grounded, safe nuclear family, it makes so much sense that you're seeking adventure or change. I had a lot of change as a child coming from a divorced family and moving a bunch. So I crave home. I crave being in one place. And while I do travel, I love knowing that I have a safe, secure home and a place. But I think also what you're speaking to is what I call in myself nostalgia. And there's also an interesting thing among creatives. And I want your thoughts on this because we kind of mine our past, whether it be through old issues of Esquire or through our own history, to have a conversation about moving forward and to be future thinking. So how do you wrestle between the memory, the emotions, nostalgia, but also future?
this question is everything about nostalgia, at least when it comes to a legacy media company. I am a deeply nostalgic person. I'm nostalgic for things that haven't even happened yet.
Me too.
Right? And I work at a media brand that was founded in 1933. So we're 92 years old. We have an archive steps from my office right now that I could get lost in, have gotten lost in. And yet at the same time, there is this tension between those two things, because there was a time when I first stepped into this role where I wouldn't publicly declare this, but I would tell people sometimes nostalgia is a disease that we need to be really careful of. Because if we just continue to look back and to rest on our laurels, we'll never move forward, as you said. And there was another thing that our creative director, Nick Sullivan, who's been here for 21 years, said to me at one point when I started 6 years ago. The 1960s was among the golden eras at Esquire. And oftentimes it can be a trap for people in my seat to look at the 60s or look at any period that is considered a golden era of Esquire and go, let's just recreate that. Let's just follow their blueprint. And I remember Nick said to me, the editors of the 60s, of the Esquire 60s, they weren't looking to the 30s for inspiration. They were looking at culture at that moment. That's what inspired them. That really spoke to me, like, got it. We can't be looking back for that sort of inspiration. At the same time, I think anybody who works at a legacy organization that is proud of their heritage, what they need to do and what I have done is really excavate that history and find what the DNA of the brand is, right? I'm sure a lot of people say this is not a new idea, but it's like once you distill, what you have at Esquire is a DNA that I think is comprised of two fundamental components. One of them is kind of men's fashion and lifestyle, right? So it's like we've always been a fashion brand for men, and also just generally lifestyle advice, etiquette, that kind of thing. And then storytelling. And by storytelling, I mean the first issue of Esquire had these illustrations of men's fashion next to stories by Ernest Hemingway or John Des Pesos, and going on from there, F. Scott Fitzgerald and so on. So it's like, how do we continue to push that legacy forward, not only in print, but in all of the kind of digital and live channels and so on that we have at our fingertips?
I'm going to also just flag that it's going to be maybe tricky during our conversation because I'm going to ask you about Esquire and personal things. So the hats you have to wear maybe get confusing because I know you're speaking on behalf of a magazine, and then also there are some personal opinions or things that you might touch on here. So we're distinguishing between the two. But I also want to say that I love what you said about nostalgia can be kind of a disease.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, I come from a very nostalgic family as well. There's such a deeply rooted sense of nostalgia with my grandfather was like a prisoner of World War II. And there's just like a lot of pathos and nostalgia and also what I might call like melancholy. And we can really get sort of trapped in this longing for a past that ultimately what you're speaking about having to do at the magazine is something we all have to do in our own lives, which is like looking back to say, what were the things about my life then that I would like to carry forward? And how do I distill those things and find the comfort and ease of John Hughes country in New York City? Like, how do I translate that? You're doing that, I think, in your own life as well as at the magazine.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I think that is true. And to your point, I think one of the traps, one of the kind of symptoms of that disease of nostalgia is that once we get some distance from a period in our life or a period even before we were alive, obviously there is this like patina or sheen or whatever you want to call it that makes it seem so great, right? Mm-hmm. And we forget about the challenges or why that was bad. And these are the kind of the traps that we can fall into. And I think for people like you and I, who we both agree that we are nostalgic for things that haven't even happened yet, the time that it takes us to go from experiencing something that had its good things and its bad things to immediately going, well, wasn't that great? Mm-hmm. Is like probably shorter than most people, right?
Absolutely. I'll be laying on the beach and I will be nostalgic for the person who lays on the beach. I'll go, oh, I can't believe I don't lay on the beach ever. And I'm laying on the beach. This is insane. It's like a nostalgia for a version of myself that I hope will someday exist. And I'm forgetting to be acknowledging I'm there right now.
I see this trait in my 10-year-old daughter. And What's funny is it sort of frustrates me. I'm like, just enjoy the moment.
Yeah.
And yet she gets that from me.
Yeah. And also with nostalgia, to admit you're nostalgic, there's also an ache for a past time and place that is separate from where we are now. So inherent in nostalgia is an ache to me. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I do think that nostalgia does remove us from the present moment, which ultimately is where all of our power is found. So to me,
Yeah.
I have to be careful with nostalgia. And that, to your point, it can be disease like. You studied to be a history professor, if I'm not mistaken, and you were on track for a PhD until somebody nudged you and said, maybe you should try something in the real world here. And you went to journalism. How did you make that leap?
Yeah, exactly as you described it. I did 4 years at the University of Illinois, studied history, and the plan was to continue to go through, get my PhD, become a history professor. And my senior year, a professor that I really respected pulled me aside and said, I think this is a great plan with one tweak, which is that you should leave for a year. You should go out into the real world and work so that way you know how good academia is when you come back.
Mm.
And I took that advice and I got a job as a newspaper reporter at a small newspaper chain in the suburbs of Chicago. And practically from day one, I fell in love with this. I had, among the many kind of stories, I was a general assignment reporter, right? So I covered everything from the local crime beat to school board meetings to, like somebody in the community turns 100 and I go to their birthday party and interview them and that sort of thing. And I remember like probably within my first week, the Catholic archdiocese in that community, they were allegedly getting a new leader or something like that. And the kind of the top officials in this Catholic church were convening and the editor pulled me aside and said, I need you to go over there and I need you to like basically ID them and just follow them. Just follow them and report back. And I remember it felt like I was in a chase movie or something like that. I was like, I can't believe they're paying me for this. This is so cool. And that was one of those things where I was like, this can't be a real job. This is a real job. Wow. And obviously I never went back to school and got a PhD or anything like that. Though I did teach journalism at NYU for a couple of years. So it did come back around where I got to be teaching a college setting. And I really underestimated how much time it takes to grade papers. Wow. Did not take that into account when I was thinking about becoming a college professor.
I don't think that anyone tells you, we're told what jobs seem appealing, and you should be a doctor, a lawyer, a journalist, a therapist, but no one tells you what your lifestyle is going to be like, and you have to figure that out on your own, which is, when I went back to school and got my master's in clinical psychology and thought I wanted to be a therapist between fashion and what I'm doing now, which is interior design. No one told me I'd be sitting in a room talking to people about the darkest parts of their life as my all day, everyday life. And I was like, I can't live my life this way. So yeah, it's like we're not always told that you might just be spending every afternoon grading papers. We learn that after we have spent the money to go to school or whatever it is. So were you a particularly observant child? Were you always quite curious? What qualities about being a journalist did you feel are natural to you?
I'm curious about people, certainly. I'm just anybody from any walk of life. I'm curious about their life, about what got them there, what they do, what they think about, and so on. I love to read. I've always loved to read anything. And, I think that is also an inherent part about being a journalist, not only being curious about people, but being curious about events and so on. And obviously the craft of writing. One of my favorite parts of this job is just getting a manuscript. And especially when you get a manuscript from an extremely talented writer and you get to sit down and you get to read this and you're like the first person reading this piece. It's, among all of the many things that I get to do, it's one of the most thrilling things.
Hmm. Well, in 2019, you were appointed editor-in-chief of Esquire. And under your leadership, you guys have taken home the National Magazine Award for General Excellence. In May of this year, you got the first ever Pulitzer Prize.
Yes.
Just incredible, incredible work that obviously has a lot to do with your leadership. The Pulitzer was for Mark Warren's Death in Alabama feature about a small town Baptist pastor and mayor who died by suicide after a right-wing website exposed his online private life. First of all, congratulations on the success that you and your team have amassed. It's incredible. But what about Mark's story affected you, touched you, and made it feel appropriate for where Esquire is right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. Mark is the one who, he won that Pulitzer Prize on behalf of Esquire, and he poured himself into that story in so many ways. Well, one of the things that was so rewarding about that, though, is the concept for that sprang from an editorial meeting. Our longtime managing editor came in a meeting on a Monday or Tuesday and said, I read this piece in the New York Times that it was really tragic, and it feels like it could be an Esquire story. And he sent actually a long reason why. Our executive editor encouraged it, and then I said, okay, let's do it. And Mark was the first person that came to mind, and then he threw himself into the story and brought back this incredible piece. But to that bigger question that you're asking, though, is that why Esquire? Why was this important? Why was this important for me? And so on. There's two things at play. One is that this is fundamentally a story about a man whose secret life was exposed and he reached the most tragic outcome. And I think that for a very long time, Esquire has been associated with kind of one type of man or masculinity, and that I don't want to exclude kind of anybody from that circle of who a man is. And we all share kind of common feelings and stuff like that. One thing that we did have done during my tenure is a few years ago, we put Elliot Page on the cover, which was, as far as I know, like the first time a transgender man has been on the cover of a men's magazine. And what I was really hoping when we did that, we did it as an as told to, which meant it was in his own words. And the reason that we did that is that I wanted the readers to be able to experience as much as they can life through the eyes of Elliot Page. This was before we've had this insane conversation about transgender people, but it was already sort of burbling a little bit right there. And I thought, well, if you could just hear from somebody, hear about their experience and hear how they feel, you might have a different opinion of it. And we got so much hate mail. I mean, more hate mail than when we write about politics and that sort of thing, when we publish that cover. But we also got a lot of mail that was very positive as well. And there's one that I will never forget, which was from a dad in Texas who said, I have a son who's transgender. And how he said, I'm so proud that my magazine, as he put it, put Elliot Page on the cover and made my son feel seen and helped me show other people, like, this is what the experience is like. That one alone was worth doing that story. And especially if that is amplified by thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people and so on. And so getting back to the Mark Warren and Bubba story is that, I mean, again, you want people to read that story and understand something about some other man's life and how he lives and so on. Pulling back from that, it's also a piece about the insane divided times that we live in. Because again, this is a story about a small community that kind of, I think, perhaps unexpectedly rallied around this guy when a right-wing, supposedly Christian website exposed his quote-unquote secret life. And as dark as the story it is, I hope that it also inspires some optimism and some hope for people as they read it.
There's so many things that come up for me as you're speaking. I mean, what I love about Esquire is that it's always been the thinking man's destination. You know, there's always been fashion and style for men, of course, but there's also always been cut through humor and personal essays and politics. And I think I'm definitely a victim of the 90s and 2000s very bro-y representation of a man and masculinity
Yeah.
that, you know, GQ and others really pushed on my generation. It was all very waxed and metrosexual and masculine. And, you know, we went from like Michael Keaton being Batman to like someone on steroids being Batman. It was like all of a sudden overnight, no one could just be a lanky intellectual. We all had to be men, you know? I have to admit, I think I was attracted to that shiny version of a men's magazine during my formative years. And I missed out on so much of the rich culture that Esquire has brought to the table. And so I'm so glad you all are there now under your leadership. But I know that also takes courage to do in our current climate, or it must, I'm assuming. Can you talk a little bit about the decision to take some of these editorial risks and to put yourself in the line of fire right now with the polarization we're feeling?
First of all, I think getting back to that question about Esquire's DNA is that sort of the thought-provoking nature of it has always been part of our DNA. I would be betraying the brand's legacy if we weren't doing those things, right? And I certainly don't want to alienate any reader when it comes to these kinds of things, but I do think that they come to us because, they do like to be challenged in a way,
Mm.
and meaning that they like to be challenged intellectually. They like to be shown new things. And again, the new things could be like, what are the latest silhouettes for suits and so on? You know what I mean? They're definitely curious people who want to explore these things. But we also do write about a lot of hot button issues. And yeah, they might be political or they might be about lifestyle or something along those lines. And, there's many ways that I feel about this. At some point, I won't have this job. And when I don't have this job, am I going to regret not taking the big swings? Because that would be a terrible regret at the end of the day. If I was like, man, I'm sure I'll think I wish we could have done more, but I don't want to have to stew on that and feel regretful about it.
Mm.
And, from a kind of a very personal level, I don't know if I'm making a dent in this at all. But, having two little girls in my house who are 10 and 6, I think their lifestyle is going to be one in which they are heterosexual. It's like, I want to at least think that maybe there will be guys that we've had some positive effect on that they can then go out and find in their romantic life or something along those lines.
Yeah, and I do think you are making a dent. As a queer person who grew up with zero representation from any large publication, it does make a dent. It does make a difference when you see yourself. And like you're saying, with the man who reached out about the Elliot Page cover, when you learn about someone's firsthand experience and you feel you know them a little bit better and can find empathy, we do come together, even if it feels slower than we want it to feel. I think one of the cover stories that was most compelling to me was The Invisible Man, this firsthand account of homelessness in America. As someone who lives in Los Angeles, I was just like, this needs to be told. Can you talk to me a little bit about how that came about?
Yeah, that's an incredible story. We published that late last year. Again, a personal essay, lengthy personal essay written by a man who was living in his car at the time. So that story came to us because that gentleman had worked at the Boston Globe many years ago. And one of the guys that he had worked with knows the editor of that piece, whose name is Ryan DiAgostino, who also edited the Pulitzer Prize winning story. And basically said, you got to talk to this guy. So they started up a conversation. And then sooner than later, he started writing this piece. It was not an easy piece to bring to fruition, partly because he was living in his car and he had intermittent internet service and so on. So that was probably one of the most unique editing experiences that we've ever had. But the reception to that piece was, I knew that story would resonate, but I didn't know how much that story would resonate, because I think the thing is that the writer was not afraid to go there. He was not afraid to really give you, he was so raw, but also beautiful in the way that he described his life and described what that experience was like and so on. And, what was so wonderful about the result of that too, is that as soon as we published that, and we didn't do this, is that somebody started a GoFundMe for him. And before we knew it, within weeks, there was over $100,000, hundreds of thousands of dollars in that GoFundMe that allowed him to get out of his car, get into an apartment, get back on his feet. He had offers from book agents and from Hollywood and so on. We didn't set out seeking to change that guy's life, but I think that was the result of it, which felt really good.
That's a beautiful story and testament to the impact that one story can have. And
Yeah.
also another impact that's far reaching and maybe not as profound, certainly to his life, but social media and where we are in the world right now, I think tries to convince us that it's one or the other, that you can either be a serious person or a frivolous person, or like the recovering elitist. It's like you can either be an elitist or you can be grounded. And ultimately, we're all in that gray area. And I think by having a story about the unhoused population through the lens of one person in your magazine next to a Celine ad or what suit to buy for your wedding this summer, whatever it is, shows people that both conversations can exist in one place and can exist in you.
I completely agree with that. And I think that isn't that one of the beautiful things about magazine media, which is that all of those things can exist together. One thing does not become frivolous because it's in the adjacent to a fashion story or those lines. And I think that is one of the things that we want to, we always seek to appeal to the totality of our reader, the totality of the man, right? And so, yes, he wants to, again, look at what kind of fragrance he should be wearing, but also wants to read a 9,000 word piece that's written by a man who's living in his car. And I think that all of those things can exist together, and it just helps make you a more well-rounded person, I hope.
Yeah. Yeah, and that tension exists in so many different ways, and that is where I love to live and explore and discuss. I did a deep dive on you before our interview, and I was struck by an image that you posted on your social that was very simple, and it was just a picture of your desk with 2 books on it, and it was a book by Ernest Hemingway and a book by Nora Ephron, and I was so struck by the tension there because one is so kind of stoic, masculine prose, the other one is quite emotionally intelligent and vulnerable, and I thought, "Oh, that's you, and that's also what you're doing at Esquire," but I'm curious, what draws you to those 2 ends of the spectrum, and how do those 2 authors affect you?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. Thank you for finding that and pointing that out. And that book, the Nora Ephron book, which I actually have about 15 copies of this because it's out of print. So in the 70s, she wrote frequently for Esquire, but in the 70s, she wrote a media column that appeared in Esquire. And this is a collection of those. So when I found out about that, I basically went on eBay and every used bookseller, and I think I bought all the copies. And now I give them out as gifts, essentially, to friends of the brand or people who work here or something. But kind of zooming out from that, I think it's not only kind of the beginning and end of Esquire or the alpha and omega, whatever you want to say, you know what I mean? Which is that, yeah, you have that really masculine Hemingway vibe that still exists and should exist. But then on the other side of it, you have that Nora Ephron, that very vulnerable, that very emotional kind of writing and insight and so on. I think that maybe that's also a reflection of at least who I aim to be in a way, is kind of a cocktail of those two things.
And why? I guess I'm always like, where does that come from? Can you speak to why? I mean, because there's so many men who aren't that way. So obviously, we can take for granted that our definition of masculinity involves an emotional intelligence and vulnerability, but that's not true of so many men. So where does that come from?
This is going to sound like an easy answer or a cop out. What you're describing, which is this sort of one dimensional view of not just masculinity, but of life. It could also be somebody who only wants to live in the Nora Ephron world. It's like, that's boring. Isn't kind of having all of those things together, isn't that what makes life interesting, or makes a magazine or a media brand interesting, or makes a person interesting, and so on? I mean, I think that's maybe kind of a superficial why. You probably want me to plunge a little deeper than that, I suppose. I don't know.
Yeah, like was your father both? Were your friends growing up allowing of, you fall and hurt your knee and you cry and it's okay? Like where did that come from? Where were you told you could be emotional?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my dad is, I wouldn't say he's like Ernest Hemingway, but he's a pretty masculine guy. I mean, he knows how to fix a car and do those kinds of things. That's a trait that I never picked up from him, unfortunately. I really wish that I had. And through my own life, I think it's interesting. In college, I was in a fraternity, which is a hyper masculine environment. But I think that even within that, a lot of my closest friends and people who I'm still remain friends with are guys who, yeah, we were in a fraternity, and I think that we could sit around and we could go to the football games or whatever. But like, we're also really interested in film and books and music and all of that sort of thing. And I don't know if I necessarily was raised in an environment where it was like your emotions on your sleeve. No, I would say probably that was not the place, but I recognize the value in that, if that
Mm.
makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something to be gained from being both. So let's aim in that direction in a way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think it doesn't really matter why. I'm just always very fascinated as to why, because I grew up with a very ambitious masculine father as well. And so it's interesting to watch a man live fully in the emotional and the masculine, stoic, and I use feminine and masculine as like not necessarily characteristics of how we act, but more like the personality characteristics that go along with what we consider culturally masculine and feminine.
Yeah.
Do you think that being a recovering know-it-all, as you would describe yourself, do you think that your partnership with Lucy Kalin has anything to do with your ability to lead and know the answers, but also partner and collaborate? You give her a lot of credit with, you're righting the ship at Esquire when you first started and feeling a little out at sea.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the two places where the credit belongs are certainly with her and other leaders, but also the people that work for me, because they had to believe in that vision and execute on it. And I'm so lucky, beyond lucky, to be surrounded by, I think, in the magazine media world, probably the most talented staff that's out there. I'm not just saying that as some sort of empty accolade. I believe that and I know that, and I rest a little easier every night knowing that. But then when it comes to Lucy, yes. So let's see, it was the winter of late 2020, something like that, where all of a sudden my then boss was like, you have a new boss. And it is this woman, Lucy Kalin, who I vaguely knew. She had been the editor of Oprah magazine and had been in the industry a long time. I certainly knew of her. I had read her stuff when I was even a teenager, when she used to write for GQ magazine. As I like to say, and this is kind of a joke, but also serious, is that I thought her job was going to be to fire me. I thought that basically or manage me out, right? Something like that. Cause things weren't going all that well. But her reputation preceded her. And so I also knew that I can learn so much from this person if I just humble myself and just say, all right, teach me everything you know. And so, yeah, there's just some very sort of basic blocking and tackling that I didn't know that she taught me, but also just leadership problems. When I say leadership problems, I mean problems that I was confronting that I needed solutions for, and she would help me work through those. And I think I gained a certain knowledge from that. And I do think that, things began to improve then when her and I were paired up together. And I still consider her a very trusted mentor on so many things.
How does being a know-it-all or a recovering know-it-all get in the way of winning or success or a positive outcome?
Okay, so that's a good question, tying it back to that. So on a kind of just a sort of funny level, it was actually pointed out to me by my wife, Sally, that I am, or at least I was, I guess, a know-it-all. And it was funny the way that she told me, I can't remember how many years ago it was, but she said something, it was she approached it very delicately. She was like, sometimes, Michael, you can come off like somebody who thinks he knows everything. And I said, you mean a know-it-all? And she was like, yeah, you might call it that. And it was like a bucket of water was poured on me. And it was all of a sudden like, oh God, yeah, I guess sometimes I do come off like that. But then if you kind of say, okay, what does that mean when it comes to your personal development, your professional development, something like that? I think the way that it can serve as a roadblock is you go, either you have this hubris in which you think that you don't need to learn anything or something like that. Or, and this is probably more the case with me, is less about hubris and more about insecurity, which is being able to ask for help or to say, I don't know that, or I'm uncomfortable with this. Let me learn, teach me, something like that. And that is something that through repetition, through reminding myself of that over and over again, I think it's now become second nature of not feeling, no matter where I am in the process, if I don't know, then raise a hand and ask, because otherwise you're just going to find yourself down this blind alley and you can only bluff your way so far. I never actually connected these two things. So, William, we're having a breakthrough right here. There probably was a really defining moment with Lucy where it's like, I could have been a know-it-all and be like, oh, what is this person going to teach me or whatever? I know what I'm doing. But I knew that I didn't know what I was doing, and that I had known that asking for help and submitting yourself to that process is only going to benefit.
That is the key feature of being able to be vulnerable and then navigate what comes next. Because in that moment of vulnerability, you could have closed up and said, I know it all, but instead you softened and you were open. And that is I think, the dance between the two. And it's also, work probably conveys a sense that you need to know all of it or most of it. People are coming to you for an answer and you need to know and you need to be definitive. I heard you talking about no-show socks. You were definitive about the fact that we are not doing no-show socks. I love that. I'm the same way. But there is something about going home and turning that off, and that tension between what works at the office and what works at home with our children and our wives and husbands. It's a different thing. So how do you navigate that ability to sort of shift?
I am somebody who, in a work environment, certainly wants to hear as many opinions as I can. But then certainly once you've digested those opinions, you need to be decisive about where you're going then after you figure those things out. Because I think the worst thing, and certainly there are times when I fall into that trap, is when you sort of hem and haw or you're indecisive or something along those lines. Then when you switch over to home, obviously decisiveness continues to be important, but it's not a patriarchy at home where I get to call all the shots. You know what I mean? It's a partnership. I think that definitely taking one hat off and putting on the other, which is to say, okay, we're a partnership now, so we need to talk these things through and we need to be decisive together on them. And, certainly I think one thing that we've learned from having kids is presenting that united front, where it's like, even if one of my kids comes to me and says, well, mom said this, and in the back of my head, I'm going, oh, I don't think I agree with that. It's like, I'm never going to say that to one of my kids. You know what I mean? It's going to be like, well, mom said it, so I guess that's how it goes. And then maybe later be like, I'm not sure I agree with that call.
Yeah. I mean, well, that's called good parenting. And it speaks to your ability to transition. Part of the reason why I call myself a recovering elitist is because when I worked at Condé Nast and when I worked in magazines and I was a stylist, it was like the best of the best was important. And I felt very pulled to the elite things in life, travel, clothing, whatever it was. But it was like I had a hard time turning that off when I got home. Same with perfectionism. My job was to be perfect on the page, but then when I got home, if dinner wasn't perfect, that wasn't a great quality.
Yeah.
So there's a recovering there, or really a finding a way to transition a little more seamlessly in the way that it sounds like you're able to do. You've described your toxic trait as being too nice, which might be the Midwesterner in you. And you talked about in the pre-interview not being an asshole, that you don't have to be an asshole. And I love that because I was raised around a few assholes in my career, which kicked my butt for better or worse. But do you feel you need others to like you to get something done? Do you feel that you can get something done and not be feared?
Ooh, that is a good question. I'd like to have consensus, which can be, I guess, could be a stand-in for the word liked. And I think that one thing that I have also had to train myself about is that through the course of a life, whether you are a professional or a parent or a human, unfortunately, you are going to have to do things that are going to make enemies of people. Maybe enemies is a strong word because enemies suggest that they're like out to get you.
Sure.
I don't necessarily mean that there are people who are going to be like, that guy's an asshole or something like that, even though I wasn't necessarily trying to be an asshole. And so that is something that I have had to teach myself, which is like, I mean, don't go around making enemies of people, but like by dint of life, that is going to happen. And so you're just going to have to be cool with it. Maybe that answers the question.
It does. It's a difficult question. I guess my hypothesis is like you can't be in a position of power and be liked by everybody. So the
Correct.
courage and the ability to be unliked by people is hard. I've spent many years wanting to be liked more than wanting to execute power and therefore not getting my way or the project's way because I would rather say yes when I meant no. So I think a lot of people listening are struggling with how to say yes when you mean no or no when you mean yes, but just being like authentic and honest in how you feel, whether it hurts someone or not, hopefully not much, but
yeah, no, I think that you are right about that. And I think that the thing that is important is you can be nice or too nice or whatever. But the thing that you need to be careful about it when I say you, I need me, is making sure that, and I guess pertains to life, but also professionally, is that people are clear about what you mean, right? Don't try to avoid having a hard conversation with somebody for that reason. And I think that's the thing that is just a reminder, which is just make sure that people know what you mean, what you want. Don't try to get out of a conversation just because it's getting uncomfortable or awkward or something along those lines.
you talked about commitment in your pre-interview and that's a prevailing theme for you. And, it seems to me like you're very good at committing. You've committed to, marriage and kids and Esquire in New York City, moving from the Midwest. And you talk about what else or what's next and not necessarily in place of where you are now, but commitment seems to be a driving force for you or motivator for you. Can you speak to that and where you stand with that today?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I talk about commitment, what I mean by that is there have been moments in my life that have felt like things are disparate, right? That there's sort of like everything's floating around and yeah, you're moving along, but things don't necessarily have a clear path. And then to grab one of those things from the ether and say, I'm committing to this and I'm going forward. I think another way of putting it is I will tell myself like, it's time to shit or get off the pot. That's sort of the idea. So whether it is with a romantic relationship or with a family or with a career or something like that, it's okay. Let's commit to this and work on it. Work on making it the best thing and improving and so on. And so now to what you just brought up, it's not saying what is the next thing to commit to, as in replacing somebody in my life or replacing my career or something like that, and saying, okay, what is the next thing now? And maybe it's this, I don't really have a hobby. Maybe I just need a hobby to commit to.
Yeah, I really related to that. And that was going to be what I asked you about next, because the word commitment and the word hobby are like oil and water. Like it's tough because, in my mind, I don't have very many hobbies either. I think it's because I start a hobby where I'm like, I'm going to start a Substack. And then I'm like, this is a fun hobby. And then I'm like, well, I need a publisher. I need a book. What's the book title? And then it becomes something more than a hobby. And then now it's stress and it's work. So I think one of the things I like to think about is like, what were 3 things I did as a child for fun? And I would ask you that.
As a child, I loved to play sports. So there is that. I loved to read. Is it bad to say that I loved to watch TV? Like I loved to watch TV as a kid.
No?
Generally kind of hang out with friends. Like I guess that those are the last 2 are a little non-specific, but yeah, those are 4 right there.
Okay, so those 4 to me would be your starting point for hobbies.
So how can I turn watching TV into a hobby?
Well, you could create a list like, the New York Times just had that list of amazing 100 best movies. So like I've started saving them, and then my husband and I are going to like watch the ones we haven't watched. So it's like, it's not necessarily a hobby in the way that we might think about like, I'm going to go learn woodworking. But I think what we're speaking to when we say hobby is a diversification of our time, adding more pleasure and fun outside of work. And so to me, it doesn't need to be more than necessarily watching TV with some intention to make it something more than just being a load on the couch.
Yeah, I think that you're right about that. Instead of just like aimlessly flipping through something or putting on a Netflix show and looking at your phone, it's like actually engaging with it.
Yeah, or like, I'm kind of a fan of AI and ChatGPT in some ways, and I'm talking to a journalist and a writer, so maybe I'm treading dangerous territory here, but I think sometimes it's interesting for a prompt.
Mhm.
So you can be like, what are 10 questions my partner and I could ask each other about this film we just saw? And then that could be a hobby. Like it could just be question time with my partner. I kind of like to get a little more creative because if I think just hobby, I really do come back to like pottery,
Yeah, right.
like the things that we think are hobbies.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. I mean, I've experimented with gardening,
Hmm.
which I guess is a kind of very classic hobby. That, to your point, I guess we're similar in that I've already gotten ahead of myself, which is like, oh, okay, how many things could we have a farmer's market stand? Like, what are we doing here? My blueberries haven't even come in yet. They're probably not going to come in, and it's
Right.
like this is where I am with that.
Do you like to cook?
I love to cook. Yes.
So like our friends and I do cooking competitions where it'll be like a theme of a tomato, and we'll have like tomato day and everybody has to make a dish with tomatoes and then there's a winner. Also for somebody who likes commitment or is ambitious, I like to win. So competition is very motivating because that makes me feel like I'm working towards something that has an outcome I might.
Yeah.
So I like to add an element of competition to things.
Yeah.
But I guess where I want to end is, what do you think that little Michael would say if he saw where you are now?
Oh, I mean, I think he would be happy, maybe impressed, something like that. Yeah. Maybe even shocked, I think. Certainly, as a teenager, I read Esquire magazine. I read Esquire, GQ, Details, you name it, all of those, right? Rolling Stone. And as I was reading them, it never even occurred to me to be like, I should be editor-in-chief of one of these. I mean, I certainly thought there were times like it would be great to write for one of these, maybe even work at one of these, but to run the whole show was something that didn't really occur to me, at least in my bedroom reading those magazines. So I think that one thing that little Michael would be like, whoa, little surprised by it, I think, in some sense.
Isn't it amazing how life takes us to these incredible places that we don't know exist if we're just open to it and we follow the things that interest us? I mean, I'm always fascinated by that. And I just want to say, I really appreciate you coming on the show today. I mean it genuinely when I say I think you're a man that we can all look up to. And I think we need more men like you in our world right now. In every,
Oh, well, thank you for saying that, William.
yeah, every realm of leadership. We all need a Michael Sebastian. So thank you so much for coming on the show and for doing the work that you do. Can you tell people a little bit about where they can learn more about you and reach out to say hello?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so first of all, Esquire, read Esquire, subscribe to Esquire, esquire.com on all of your social channels, buy the magazine, subscribe to the magazine, all of those things. I'm also on Instagram, Michael J. Sebastian. So I'm there too, if you want to see more pictures of my desk and so on. One thing that I do love is that I write a weekly email, like everybody else who has a Substack. I write a weekly email to a certain tier of Esquire subscribers, right? And I don't like to phone that in. I spend a considerable amount of time thinking about that, writing it, working on it with an editor and so on. And one of the most rewarding things about that is how many people email me back every week. And it's so interesting to have that direct conversation with the people who are reading us and subscribing to us and so on. And it'll be everything from just like a recommendation that they might send me or a really thoughtful response to something that I've written.
I do feel that you give so much of yourself to everything you do. Regardless of what you post, you end up putting something in there that feels deeply personal. So thank you for being here today.
William, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure having this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Michael Sebastian, and I am a recovering know-it-all.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Recovering Elitist. Our show is produced by Christopher Michael, Kelsey McWilliams, and Sasha Grinblatt, with audio post-production by Griffin James. Special thanks to Chase Coughlin for our original theme music and Justin Teodoro for our original artwork. We'd really like to hear from you. What are you recovering from? We hope you'll join the conversation on Instagram or at therecoveringelitist.com, and we hope you'll like and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts for new episodes each and every week. Thank you for listening.